Hello, this is Lecture 2 about the history of the United States. Last time, we started talking about the country's origins as a group of obscure colonies hugging the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Since then, the United States has undergone a remarkable transformation. One political analyst has called it the first universal nation. So today we will continue talking about the US during the times of the Cold War, Korean conflict, and Vietnam, and up until the present day. The United States played a major role in global affairs in the years immediately after the Second World War, especially through its influence in the newly formed United Nations and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Victorious in that struggle, the US was confident of its mission both at home and abroad. US leaders wanted to maintain the democratic structure that they had defended and also to share the benefits of prosperity as widely as possible. For them, as publisher Henry Luce of Time magazine put it, this was the American century. For 20 years, most Americans remained sure of this confident approach. They accepted the need for a strong stance against the Soviet Union in the World War that started after 1945. They endorsed the growth of government authority and accepted the outlines of the welfare state that was first formulated during the New Deal. The Cold War grew out of long-standing disagreements between the United States and the Soviet Union over which type of government and economic system produced the most liberty, equality, and prosperity. So the United States hoped to share with other countries its concept of liberty, equality, and democracy. While the rest of the world was in turmoil, struggling with civil wars and disintegration, the US hoped to provide the stability to make peaceful reconstruction possible. Unable to forget the problems of the Great Depression back in 1929-1940, America now fostered its familiar position of free trade and sought to eliminate trade barriers, both to create markets for American products and to ensure the stability and ability of Western European nations to export as a means to generate economic growth and rebuild their economies. Reduced trade barriers were expected to promote economic growth both at home and abroad and bolster stability with US friends and allies. The Soviet Union, however, had its own agenda. So the Russian historical tradition of centralized autocratic government contrasted with the American emphasis on democracy. Marxist-Leninist ideology had been downplayed during the war, but still guided Soviet policy. Devastated by the struggle in which 20 million Soviet citizens had died, the Soviet Union was intent on rebuilding and on protecting itself from another such terrible conflict. The Soviets were particularly concerned about another invasion of their territory from the West. Having repelled Hitler, they were determined to preclude another such attack. So now the Soviet Union wanted to bring communist regimes to power in Central and Eastern Europe. But the United States had declared the restoration of independence and self-government to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe one of its major goals. So the United Nations vowed to contain Soviet expansionism. Harry Truman succeeded Franklin Roosevelt as president before the end of the Second World War. An unpretentious man who had previously served as Democratic senator from Missouri, then as vice president, Truman initially felt ill-prepared to govern the United States. Roosevelt had not confided in him about complex post-war issues, and he had little prior experience in international affairs. "I am not big enough for this job," he told his former colleague once. But Truman responded quickly to new challenges. Impulsive, he proved willing to make quick decisions about the problems that he faced. A sign on his White House desk, since famous in American politics, read, "The buck stops here." And it reflected his willingness to take responsibility for his actions. His judgments about how to respond to the Soviet Union had an important impact on the early Cold War. The Cold War developed as differences about the shape of the post-war world created suspicion and distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. The first such conflict occurred over Poland. Moscow demanded a government subject to Soviet influence. Washington wanted a more independent, respective government following the Western model. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 had produced a wide-ranging agreement open to different interpretations. Among its provisions was the promise of free and unfettered elections in Poland. At his first meeting with Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, Truman revealed his intention to stand firm on Polish self-determination, trying to persuade the Soviet diplomat about the need to carry out the Yalta Accords. When Molotov protested, Truman said, "I have never been talked to like that in my life. Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." Relations deteriorated from that point onward. During the closing months of the Second World War, Soviet military forces occupied all of Central and Eastern Europe. Moscow used its military power to support the efforts of the communist parties in Eastern Europe and crush the democratic parties. Communist parties loyal to Moscow quickly expanded their power and influence in all countries of the region, culminating in the coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948. Public statements defined the beginning of the Cold War. In 1946, Stalin declared that international peace was impossible under the present capitalist development of the world economy. Winston Churchill, wartime Prime Minister of Great Britain, delivered a famous dramatic speech in Fulton, Missouri, with Truman sitting on the platform during the address. Winston Churchill said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Britain and the United States, he declared, had to work together to counter the Soviet threat. Containment. Containment of the Soviet Union became American policy in the post-war years. George Kennan, a top official at the US Embassy in Moscow, defined the new approach in a long telegram that he sent to the State Department in 1946. He extended his analysis after he returned home in an article published under the signature X in the prestigious journal called Foreign Affairs. Pointing to Russia's traditional sense of insecurity, Kennan argued that the Soviet Union would not soften its stance under any circumstances. Moscow, he wrote, was committed fanatically to the belief that with the US there can be no permanent modus vivendi, that it is deliberate and it is necessary that the internal harmony of our society be disrupted. So Moscow's pressure to expand its power had to be stopped through a firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. So the first significant application of the containment doctrine came in the Eastern Mediterranean. Great Britain had been supporting Greece, where communist forces threatened the ruling monarchy in a civil war, and Turkey, where the Soviet Union pressed for territorial concessions and the right to build naval bases on the Bosphorus. In 1947, Britain told the United States that it could no longer afford such aid. Quickly, the US State Department devised a plan for US assistance. In a statement that came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, Truman declared, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." To that end, he asked Congress to provide $400 million for economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey, and the money was appropriated. Containment also called for extensive economic aid to assist the recovery of war-torn Western Europe. With many of the region's nations economically and politically unstable, the United States feared that local communist parties directed by Moscow would capitalize on their wartime resistance to the Nazis and come to power. So something needed to be done. Secretary of State George Marshall noted for "the patient is sinking while the doctors deliberate." So in mid-1947, Marshall asked troubled European nations to draw up a program directed against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. The Soviets participated in the first planning meeting, but then departed. So the remaining 16 nations hammered out a request that finally came to $17 billion for a 4-year period. In early 1948, Congress voted to assist European economic recovery, dubbed the Marshall Plan, and generally regarded as one of the most successful US foreign policy initiatives in history. Post-war Germany was divided into US, Soviet, British, and French zones of occupation, with the former German capital of Berlin itself divided into 4 zones near the center of the Soviet zone. The United States, Britain, and France had discussed converting their zones into a single self-governing republic. But the Soviet Union opposed plans to unite Germany, and ministerial-level four-power discussions on Germany broke down. When the Western powers announced their intention to create a consolidated federal state from those zones, Stalin responded. On the 23rd of June, 1948, Soviet forces blockaded Berlin, cutting off all road and rail access from the West. American leaders feared that losing Berlin was but a prelude to losing Germany and successfully all Europe. So therefore, in a demonstration of Western resolve known as the Berlin Airlift, Allied air forces took to the sky, flying supplies into Berlin. US, French, and British planes delivered nearly 2,250,000 tons of goods, including food and coal. So Stalin had nothing else to do but to lift the blockade after 231 days. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe alarmed the West. The United States led the effort to create a military alliance to complement economic efforts at containment. In 1949, the United States and 11 other countries established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, an alliance based on the principle of collective security. An attack against one was to be considered an attack against all, to be met by appropriate force. The next year, the United States defined its defense aims clearly. The National Security Council undertook a full-fledged review of American foreign and defense policy. The resulting document, known as NSC 68, signaled a new direction in American security policy. Based on the assumption that the Soviet Union was engaged in a financial and fanatical effort to seize control of all governments wherever possible, the document committed America to assist allied nations anywhere in the world which seemed threatened by Soviet aggression. So the United States proceeded to increase defense spending dramatically in response to Soviet threats against Europe and the American, British, and French presence in West Berlin. While seeking to prevent communist ideology from gaining further adherence in Europe, the United States also responded to challenges elsewhere. So in China, Americans worried about the advances of Mao Zedong and his Communist Party. During the Second World War, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces waged a civil war even as they fought the Japanese. Chiang had been a wartime ally, but even American support could not bolster a government that was hopelessly inefficient and corrupt. Mao's forces finally seized power in 1949, and when he announced that his new regime would support the Soviet Union against the United States, it appeared that communism was spreading out of control, at least in Asia. The Korean War brought armed conflict between the United States and China. The Allies had divided Korea along the 38th parallel after liberating it from Japan at the end of the Second World War. The Soviet Union accepted Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel. So the United States did the same in the South. Originally intended as a matter of military convenience, the dividing line became more rigid as Cold War tensions escalated. So both major powers set up governments in their respective occupation zones and continued to support them even after departing. In June 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and attacked south, overrunning Seoul. Truman, perceiving the North Koreans as Soviet pawns in the global struggle, readied American forces and ordered General Douglas MacArthur to Korea. Meanwhile, the United States was able to secure a UN resolution branding North Korea as an aggressor. Truce talks began in July 1951. The two sides finally reached an agreement in July 1953 during the first term of Dwight Eisenhower, Truman's successor. Cold War struggles were also occurring in the Middle East. Strategically important as a supplier of oil, the region appeared vulnerable in 1946 when Soviet troops failed to leave Iran as promised, even after British and American forces had already withdrawn. The United States demanded a UN condemnation of Moscow's continued troop presence in Iran. When the United States observed Soviet tanks entering the region, Washington readied for a direct clash. Confronted by US resolve, the Soviets withdrew their forces. 2 years later, the United States officially recognized the new state of Israel, 15 minutes after it was proclaimed. a decision Truman made over strong resistance from Marshall and the State Department. While cultivating close ties with Israel, the United States still sought to keep the friendship of Arab states opposed to Israel. Dwight Eisenhower, who assumed the presidency in 1953, was different from his predecessor. A war hero, he had a natural, homey manner that made him widely popular. In the post-war years, he served as Army Chief of Staff, the President of Columbia University, and finally head of NATO, before seeking the Republican presidential nomination. Although he was skillful at getting people to work together, he sought to play a restrained public role. Still, he shared with Truman a basic view of American foreign policy. Eisenhower, too, perceived communism as a force struggling for world supremacy. He believed that Moscow, under leaders such as Stalin, was trying to orchestrate worldwide revolution. In his first inaugural address, he declared, "Forces of good and evil are massed and armed and opposed as rarely before in history. Freedom is pitted against slavery, lightness against dark." In office, Eisenhower argued that containment did not go far enough to stop Soviet expansion. Rather, a more aggressive policy of liberation was necessary to free those subjugated by communism. But for all of the rhetoric, when democratic rebellions broke out in areas under Soviet domination, such as Hungary in 1956, the United States stood back as Soviet forces suppressed them. Eisenhower's basic commitment to contain communism remained, and to that end, he increased American reliance on a nuclear shield. The Manhattan Project during the Second World War had created the first atomic bombs. In 1950, Truman had authorized the development of a new and more powerful hydrogen weapon. Now, Eisenhower, in an effort to keep budget expenditures under control, proposed a policy of massive retaliation. The United States, under this doctrine, was prepared to use atomic weapons if the nation or its vital interests were attacked. In practice, however, Eisenhower deployed U.S. military forces with great caution, resisting all suggestions to consider the use of nuclear weapons in Indochina, where the French were ousted by Vietnamese communist forces in 1954, or in Taiwan, where the United States pledged to defend the nationalist Chinese regime against attack by the People's Republic of China. In the Middle East, Eisenhower resisted the use of force when British and French forces occupied the Suez Canal and Israel invaded the Sinai in 1956, following Egypt's nationalization of the canal. Under heavy U.S. pressure, British, French, and Israeli forces withdrew from Egypt, which retained control of the canal. So nor only did the Cold War shape U.S. foreign policy, it also had a profound effect on domestic affairs. Foreign events and espionage scandals contributed to the anti-communist hysteria of that period. In 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic device, which shocked Americans into believing that the United States would be the target of a Soviet attack. In 1950, the US government uncovered a British-American spy network that transferred to the Soviet Union materials about the development of the atomic bomb. The capture and trial of the spies for revealing atomic secrets furthered the perception of a domestic communist danger. So as the Cold War unfolded in the decade and a half after the Second World War, the United States experienced phenomenal economic growth. The war brought the return of prosperity, and in the post-war period, the United States consolidated its position as the world's richest country. Gross national product jumped from about $200 billion in 1940 to $300 billion in 1950, to more than $500 billion in 1960. More and more Americans now consider themselves part of the middle class. The growth had different sources. The automobile industry was partially responsible, as the number of automobiles produced annually quadrupled between 1946 and 1955. A housing boom, stimulated in part by easily affordable mortgages, fueled the expansion. The rise in defense spending as the Cold War escalated also played a part. After 1945, the major corporations in America grew larger. New conglomerates, firms with holdings in a variety of industries, led the way. For example, International Telephone and Telegraph bought Sheraton Hotels, Continental Banking, Hartford Fire Insurance, and many others. Smaller franchise operations, like McDonald's fast food restaurants, provided still another pattern. Large corporations also developed holdings overseas, where labor costs were often lower. Workers found their own lives changing as industrial America changed. Fewer workers produced goods, more provided services. By 1956, a majority held white-collar jobs, working as corporate managers, teachers, salespersons, and office employees. Some firms granted a guaranteed annual wage, long-term employment contracts, and other benefits. Farmers, on the other hand, faced tough times. Gains in productivity led to agricultural consolidation, as farming became a big business. Family farms, in turn, found it difficult to compete, and more farmers left the land. Americans moved out of inner cities into the suburbs, where they hoped to find affordable housing for the larger families spawned by the post-war baby boom. Developers like William Levitt built new communities with homes that all looked alike, using the techniques of mass production. So Levitt's houses were prefabricated or partly assembled in a factory rather than on the final location. The homes were modest, but Levitt's methods cut costs and allowed new owners to possess at least a part of the American dream. As suburbs grew, businesses moved into the new areas. Large shopping centers containing a great variety of stores changed consumer patterns. The number of these centers rose from 8 at the end of the Second World War to 3,840 in 1960. With easy parking and convenient evening hours, customers could avoid city shopping entirely. New highways created better access to the suburbs and its shops. The Highway Act of 1956 provided $26 billion, the largest public works expenditure in U.S. history, to build more than 64,000 kilometers of federal roads to link together all parts of the country. Television, too, had a powerful impact on social and economic patterns. Developed in the 1930s, it was not widely marketed until after the war. In 1946, the country had fewer than 17,000 television sets. 3 years later, consumers were buying 250,000 sets a month. And by 1960, 3/4 of all families owned at least one set. In the middle of the decade, the average family watched television 4 to 5 hours a day. Popular shows for children included Howdy Doody Time and the Mickey Mouse Club. Older viewers preferred situation comedies like I Love Lucy and Father Knows Best. Americans of all ages became exposed to increasingly sophisticated advertisements for products said to be necessary for the good life. So John Kennedy, Democratic victor in the election of 1960, was 43, so he was the youngest man ever to win the presidency. On television, in a series of debates with opponent Richard Nixon, he appeared able, articulate, and very energetic. In his campaign, he spoke of moving aggressively into the new decade, the new frontier, as he called it. So in his first inaugural address, he concluded with an eloquent plea. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Throughout his brief presidency, Kennedy's special combination of grace, wit, and style sustained his popularity and influenced generations of politicians to come. Kennedy wanted to exert strong leadership to extend economic benefits to all citizens. But a razor-thin margin of victory limited his mandate. Even though the Democratic Party controlled both houses of Congress, the Conservative Party resisted plans to increase federal aid to education, provide health insurance for the elderly, and create a new Department of Urban Affairs. And so, despite his rhetoric, Kennedy's policies were often limited and restrained. The president made some gestures toward civil rights leaders, but did not embrace the goals of the civil rights movement until nearly the end of his presidency. He failed in his effort to aid public education and to provide medical care for the elderly. He gained only a modest increase in the minimum wage. Still, he did secure funding for a space program and established the Peace Corps to send men and women overseas to assist developing countries in meeting their own needs. Kennedy had planned an ambitious legislative program for the last year of his term. But then, on the 22nd of November 1963, he was assassinated while riding in an open car during a visit to Dallas, Texas. It was a traumatic and defining moment for a generation, just as the death of Franklin Roosevelt had been for an earlier one. In retrospect, Kennedy's liberal reputation stems from his style and ideals than from the implementation of his policies. But because the agenda set out in the last year of his presidency was enacted in 1964 and 1966, he was seen as a liberal force for change after his death. Lyndon Johnson. So Lyndon Johnson, a Texan who was a majority leader in the Senate before becoming Kennedy's vice president, was a masterful politician. He had been schooled in Congress, where he developed an extraordinary ability to get things done. As president, he wanted to use his power aggressively to eliminate poverty and spread the benefits of prosperity to all. Johnson took office determined to secure the measures that Kennedy had sought. Immediate priorities were bills to reduce taxes and guarantee civil rights. Soon, Johnson addressed other issues as well. By the spring of 1964, he had begun to use the name Great Society to describe his reform program. On the economic front, Johnson pushed successfully for a tax cut, then pressed for a poverty program that Kennedy had initiated. He announced, "This administration today here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. The Office of Economic Opportunity provided training for the poor and established various community action programs to give the poor themselves a voice in housing, health, and education programs. Medical care came next. Truman once had proposed a centralized scheme more than 20 years earlier, but had failed to gain congressional passage. Under Johnson, Congress enacted Medicare. That was a health insurance program for the elderly. Also, Medicaid was introduced, a program providing healthcare assistance for the poor. Similarly, Johnson succeeded in the effort to provide aid for elementary and secondary schooling, where Kennedy had failed. The measure that was enacted gave money to the states based on the number of their children from low-income families. So the Great Society program reached even further. A new Housing Act provided rent supplements for the poor and established a Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Johnson administration also addressed transportation safety issues. In September 1966, Johnson signed into law 2 transportation bills. The first provided funds to state and local governments for developing safety programs, while the other set up federal safety standards for cars and tires. In all, the Great Society was the greatest burst of legislative activity since the New Deal. But support for the Johnson administration policies began to weaken as early as 1966. Some of Johnson's programs did not live up to expectations. Many programs went underfunded. Still, the Great Society achieved some reductions in poverty. For example, between 1965 and 1968, Black family income rose from 54% to 60% of white family income. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States remained locked in bitter conflict with communist countries. Most American leaders throughout the period saw the world in Cold War terms and sought to counter the perceived threat of the Soviet bloc. Cuba became a battleground in the Kennedy years. Ever since Fidel Castro's Revolutionary Army seized power in 1959 and gained the support of the Soviet Union, relations with Cuba had been strained. The United States broke diplomatic ties just before Kennedy assumed office, and the Central Intelligence Agency began training Cuban exiles to invade their homeland. The attack at the Bay of Pigs in the spring of 1961 failed miserably. Kennedy, who approved the plan initiated by the Eisenhower administration, accepted responsibility for the defeat. The next year, seeking to recoup lost prestige, Kennedy stood firm when he learned the Soviet Union was secretly installing offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba. After considering different options, he decided on a quarantine to prevent Soviet ships from bringing additional missiles to Cuba. And he demanded publicly that the Soviets remove the weapons. After several days of tension, during which the world was closer than ever before to nuclear war, the Soviets backed down. Supporters applauded Kennedy's courage, but critics charged that he risked nuclear disaster when quiet diplomacy might have been more appropriate. Well, in retrospect, however, the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in US-Soviet relations, as both sides saw the need to defuse tensions that could lead to direct military conflict. The following year, the United States the Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed a landmark document called Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere. Space. So space became another arena for competition after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, an artificial satellite, in 1957. Americans were chastened, for the Russians had beaten them into orbit with a rocket that could have easily carried a nuclear bomb. The United States only managed to launch its first satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958. The public mood worsened when the Soviets placed the first man in orbit in 1961. Kennedy responded by committing the United States to land a man on the moon and bring him back before this decade is out. With Project Mercury, in August 1962, John Glenn Jr. became the first U.S. astronaut to orbit the Earth. In the mid-1960s, U.S. scientists used the Gemini program to examine the effects of prolonged spaceflight on man. The Apollo project achieved Kennedy's goal. In July 1969, with hundreds of millions of television viewers watching around the world, Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the surface of the moon. Other Apollo flights followed, but many Americans began to question the value of manned space flight. So in the early 1970s, as other priorities became more important, the United States scaled down the space program. Some Apollo missions were scrapped. Only one of the two proposed Skylab space stations was built. Indochina was still another civil and Cold War battlefield. Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese communist, sought to liberate his nation from colonial rule and took the American War for Independence as his model. So after the Allies defeated the Japanese in 1945, they still had to deal with Ho Chi Minh. At an international conference in Geneva, Vietnam was divided, with Ho Chi Minh in power in the north and Ngo Dinh Diem, a Roman Catholic anti-communist in a largely Buddhist population, heading the government in the south. Elections were to be held 2 years later to unify the country. However, persuaded that the fall of Vietnam could lead to the fall of Burma, Thailand, and Indonesia, Eisenhower backed Diem's refusal to hold elections in 1956 and began to increase economic and military aid. Kennedy increased assistance and sent small numbers of military advisors, but still the struggle between North and South continued. The situation was more unstable than ever before. Guerrillas in the south, known as Vietcong, challenged the South Vietnamese government, sometimes covertly, sometimes through the National Liberation Front, their political arm. Aided by North Vietnam, they gained ground, especially among the peasants in the countryside. Determined to halt communist advances in South Vietnam, Johnson made the Vietnam War his own. After his re-election in November 1964, he embarked on a policy of escalation. From 25,000 troops at the start of 1965, the number of soldiers, both volunteers and draftees, arose to 500,000 in 1968. A massive bombing campaign wrought havoc in both North and South Vietnam. With battles shown on television, Americans began to protest their country's involvement in the war. Such foreign policy specialists as George Kennan found fault with US policies. Others argued that the US had no strategy for ending the war. Americans watched as the massive military campaign seemed to have no effect on the course of the war. Public dissatisfaction with US policy, especially among the young, pressured Johnson to begin negotiating for peace. Anti-war sentiment in 1968 led Johnson to renounce any intention of seeking another term. So Republican Richard Nixon won the election as he ran on a plan to extricate the United States from the war and to increase law and order at home. A ceasefire, negotiated for the United States by Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, was finally signed in 1973. Although American troops departed, the war lingered on into the spring of 1975, when North Vietnam consolidated its control over the entire country. The war had a tremendous price. It left Vietnam devastated, with millions mutilated or killed. The United States spent over $150 billion in a losing effort that cost 58,000 American lives. The war led many young Americans to question the actions of their own nation and the values it sought to uphold. As the war wound down, the Nixon administration was able to deal pragmatically with the major communist powers. The most dramatic step was opening ties to the People's Republic of China. In 1971 and 1972, Nixon softened the American stance, eased trade restrictions, and became the first American president ever to visit Beijing. With the Soviet Union, Nixon was equally successful in pursuing a policy of detente. Several months after his trip to China, he visited the Soviet Union. He held several cordial meetings with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, in which they agreed to limit stockpiles of missiles, cooperate in space, and ease trading restrictions. The strategic arms limitation talks culminated in 1972 in an arms control agreement, limiting the growth of nuclear arsenals and restricting anti-ballistic missile systems. Nixon confronted a series of economic problems during his presidency. By 1973, the inflation rate was 9%. The Dow Jones average of industrial stocks fell 36% between November 1968 and May 1970. And the unemployment rate reached 6.6% by the end of 1970. Nixon imposed wage price controls in 1971, but they did little good. Factors beyond Nixon's control undermined his economic policies. In 1973, the war between Israel, Egypt, and Syria prompted Saudi Arabia to impose an embargo on oil shipped to Israel's ally, the United States. Other member nations of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries quadrupled their prices. Americans faced both shortages and rapidly rising prices. Even with the embargo ended the next year, prices remained high. Higher energy prices affected all areas of American economic life. In 1974, inflation reached 12%, causing disruptions that led to even higher unemployment rates. This era of recession and inflation brought an end to the unprecedented economic boom America had enjoyed since 1948. So, while trying to manage the economy, Nixon also sought to restore law and order. rising crime rates in American cities and political protests increased drug use and more permissive views about sex in U.S. universities, which offended many Americans. Seeking to strengthen his own political constituency, Nixon chose to use government power to counter disruption. He lashed out at demonstrators, attacked the press for distorted coverage, and sought to silence his opponents. That strategy backfired in the Watergate affair. Facing Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress during his first term, Nixon wanted to win an overwhelming re-election victory in 1972. The Committee to Re-elect the President launched a massive fundraising campaign to collect money before contributions had to be reported under a new law. Early in 1972, Nixon's team proposed to tap the telephones of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate apartment complex in Washington. The attempt failed. When the burglars, carrying money and documents that could ultimately be traced to the White House, were arrested, the administration decided to cover up its involvement. 6 days after the discovery of the break-in, Nixon told the Central Intelligence Agency to order the Federal Bureau of Investigation to cease its investigation on the grounds that national security was at stake. In fact, the break-in was just one aspect of a campaign to locate and destroy people whom the administration considered enemies. These activities involved illegal wiretapping, break-ins, and fundraising. Although Nixon was overwhelmingly re-elected that year, the press, particularly the Washington Post, continued to investigate. As the scandal unfolded, the Democratic majority in the Congress instituted impeachment proceedings against Nixon. As the evidence of his involvement began to mount, he resigned on 9th of August, 1974. Gerald Ford, an unpretentious man who had spent most of his public life in Congress, became Nixon's vice president, and upon Nixon's resignation, Ford became president. His first priority was to restore trust in the government, which had been shaken by impeachment proceedings aimed at removing Nixon from office. Initially, Ford enjoyed a great deal of confidence, but it quickly eroded when he pardoned Nixon and thus headed off any possible prosecution in the future. In public policy, Ford followed the course of Nixon had set. Economic problems remained serious as inflation and unemployment continued to rise, and the gross national product fell. Ford imposed measures to curb inflation, which led to a 12% unemployment rate and the most serious recession since the Great Depression. Tax cuts, coupled with higher unemployment benefits, led to modest recovery, but still no end to economic difficulties. Jimmy Carter, former Democratic governor of Georgia, won the presidency in 1976. Portraying himself during the campaign as an outsider to Washington policies, he promised a fresh approach to governing. But his very lack of experience at the national level complicated his tenure from the very start. In economic affairs, Carter at first permitted a policy of deficit spending. When the Federal Reserve Board increased the money supply to cover deficits, inflation rose to 10% a year. Carter responded by cutting the budget to slow inflation, but cuts affected social programs. Carter also faced criticism for his failure to develop an effective energy policy. He presented a comprehensive program aimed at reducing dependence on foreign oil Opponents rejected it in Congress. Carter hoped to re-establish democratic leadership, but his efforts failed to gain either public or congressional support. By the end of his term, his disapproval rating reached 77%, and Americans began to look toward the Republican Party again. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the United States continued to pursue an active policy in world affairs, addressing issues in Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. However, in the late 1970s, serious problems emerged in relations with the Soviet Union, and particularly with Iran. President Ford continued the Nixon administration policy of pursuing detente with the Soviet Union. In November 1974, Ford met with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev in Vladivostok. The meeting resulted in a preliminary agreement on further US-Soviet arms control measures. It also helped pave the way for a multi-nation conference in Helsinki, Finland, in 1975. The Helsinki Conference, the largest summit meeting in European history, was attended by the leaders of 35 European countries, as well as the United States and Canada. The conference produced a historic final act, which incorporated some significant points championed by Western countries, as well as some advocated by regimes in the Eastern Bloc. It recognized the permanence of the changes in European borders after the Second World War, an acknowledgement that Moscow had long sought. So the Helsinki Final Act also contained pledges to respect individual rights and human liberties. Western nations hoped to increase pressure on Eastern Bloc governments by getting them to sign the pledge. In fact, Western nations effectively used periodic Helsinki Review meetings to call attention to various abuses of human rights by communist regimes of the Eastern Bloc. President Jimmy Carter helped to achieve a significant breakthrough between Egypt and Israel, in which these countries ended 30 years in a state of war. Acting as both mediator and participant, Carter met in 1978 at Camp David, Maryland, the presidential retreat, with Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menahem Begin to negotiate a peace settlement. Both leaders returned to the United States to sign the peace treaty at the White House in March 1979. Carter also secured Senate ratification of treaties returning the Panama Canal to Panama by the year 2000. But Carter enjoyed less success with the Soviet Union. At SALT II agreement, further limiting nuclear stockpiles was signed, but not ratified by the US Senate, in part to protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The same year, Carter began a defense buildup that paved the way for the huge expenditures of the 1980s. In 1979, Carter encountered even more trouble with Iran. After a fundamentalist revolution led by Shiite Muslim leader Ayatollah Khomeini replaced the corrupt but friendly regime, Carter admitted the deposed Shah to the United States for medical treatment. Angry Iranian militants seized the American embassy in Tehran and held 53 American hostages for more than a year. Despite his efforts, Carter could not secure their release, and his failure contributed to his electoral defeat. Meanwhile, African Americans launched a movement to guarantee fair treatment everywhere. They won a majority victory in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled that separate educational facilities for black children were not equal to those for white children. The decision started the process of desegregating the nation's public schools. In the 1960s, led by the Reverend Martin Luther King, and with the support of President Lyndon Johnson, African Americans won passage of civil rights and voting rights legislation. Some black leaders, such as Malcolm X, argued against interracial cooperation, and some militant calls for reform led to violence. However, many African Americans made quiet, steady progress into the ranks of the middle class, leading to a profound demographic change in American society. During the 1960s and 70s, many American women expressed frustration that they did not have the same opportunities as men. Led by writer Betty Friedan and journalist Gloria Steinem, they organized a movement that helped change laws and traditions to give women the chance to compete equally with men in business and education. However, their efforts to adopt a constitutional amendment guaranteeing equal rights for women fell short when only 35 of the necessary 38 states ratified it. A new generation of Native American leaders organized to defend the rights the government had promised in various treaties with tribal groups. They used the court system to regain control of tribal lands and water rights. They used the legislative process to get the assistance they needed to house and educate their people. The first Native American to be elected to the Senate was Ben Nighthorse Campbell in 1992. Hispanic Americans, especially those whose families came from Mexico, Central America, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, became more politically active too. They were elected to local, state, and national offices, and they organized to fight discrimination. Cesar Chavez, for example, led a nationwide consumer boycott of California grapes that forced growers to negotiate with his United Farm Workers Union for higher wages and improved working conditions. Many students became politically active to protest the war in Vietnam, which they believed was immoral. They organized large protests that eventually put pressure on President Johnson to begin peace negotiations. Young people also began to reject their parents' cultural values. The most visible sign of the so-called counterculture were long hair, rock and roll music, and the use of illegal drugs. Americans concerned about the environment organized efforts to reduce air and water pollution. The year 1970 saw the first Earth Day celebration and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Environmental legislation reflected the need to reduce pollutants without imposing burdensome costs on industries. The great social changes of the 1950s, 1980s grew out of an open, fluid, and diverse society. Demands for change were sometimes peaceful, sometimes deadly. Compromises were necessary. Surely, the United States changed to better reflect its multicultural foundation. The United States has always experienced periods of political polarization, as Americans debated ways to deal with international events, demographic change, and the effects of technological innovation. The last decades of the 20th century were no exception. The liberal activism of the 1960s and 70s was eclipsed by a new conservatism in the 1980s. Conservatives advocated limited government, a strong national defense, a firm stance against communism, tax cuts to spur economic growth, tough anti-crime measures, more religious expansion in public life, and a stricter code for social behavior. Former actor and Republican governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who represented stability to many Americans, won 2 terms as president. The central theme of Reagan's domestic policy was that the federal government had become too big and federal taxes too high. In foreign policy, President Reagan sought a more assertive role for the nation. In relations with the Soviet Union, President Reagan's declared policy was one of peace through strength. During his first term, the administration increased spending on defense expenditures. After his re-election in 1984, Reagan softened his rigid position on arms control. A recession marked the early years of Reagan's presidency, but conditions started to improve in 1983 as the United States entered one of the longest periods of sustained economic growth since the Second World War. In 1988, Reagan's vice president during all 8 years of his presidency, George Bush, was elected the 41st president of the United States. Bush faced a dramatically changing world. As the Cold War ended after 40 bitter years, the communist empire broke up and the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, and reformist President Mikhail Gorbachev, whom Bush had supported, resigned. While Bush hailed the march of democracy, he still insisted on restraint in US policy toward the group of new nations. In foreign policy, President Bush's greatest test came when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, then threatened to move into Saudi Arabia. The UN Security Council passed 12 resolutions condemning the Iraqi invasion and imposing wide-ranging economic sanctions on Iraq. The 12th resolution, issued on the 29th of November, approved the use of force by UN member states if Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait by the 15th of January 1991. War broke out less than 24 hours after the UN deadline. The United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait succeeded in liberating Kuwait. At home, Americans faced some deep and familiar problems as the United States again found itself in recession. Americans moved to a more centrist position in 1992 and elected as president the governor of Arkansas. His name was Bill Clinton. He organized his campaign around the themes of youth and change. Some of Clinton's proposals were quite liberal, such as his plan for a government-managed healthcare system, which Congress never voted on. Another proposal, ending government payments to welfare recipients and helping them get jobs, was co-opted from conservatives and eventually proved quite successful. In 1998, as a result of issues surrounding personal indiscretions with a young woman, White House intern Monica Lewinsky, Clinton was the second US president to be impeached by the House of Representatives. He was tried in the Senate and found not guilty of the charges brought against him. Normal differences in politics turned especially bitter after the presidential election of 2000. The popular vote and the Electoral College vote were nearly evenly divided between Democrat Al Gore and Republican George W. Bush. Thousands of ballots cast in the state of Florida were contested. After a series of court challenges over laws and proceedings governing recounts, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a narrow decision that effectively gave the election to Bush. Bush expected to focus on domestic issues such as education, economy, and social security. But his presidency changed irrevocably on the 11th of September 2001. That morning, Middle Eastern terrorists simultaneously hijacked 4 passenger airplanes and used 2 of them as suicide vehicles to destroy the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. A third clashed into the Pentagon building, the Defense Department headquarters outside Washington. The 4th plane, probably meant for the U.S. Capitol, crashed into the Pennsylvania countryside as passengers fought the hijackers. The death toll, most of it consisting of civilians at the World Trade Center, was approximately 3,000 people, exceeding that of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So the world community confronted the threat posed by global terrorism with an unprecedented worldwide coalition. The North Atlantic Council invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, thereby classifying the 9/11 terrorist attacks as an attack on all member states, and pledged any necessary assistance. Both the UN General Assembly and Security Council passed by acclamation resolutions condemning the terrorist attacks on the United States. The United States attributed responsibility for 9/11 to Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda organization. A full-scale campaign was launched against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and support structures. A total of 136 countries offered a range of military assistance to the United States. As a result of the operation known as Enduring Freedom, the Taliban was removed from power, and the first elections in more than 40 years took place in Afghanistan. In September 2002, President Bush warned Iraq that unless it fully cooperated with United Nations weapons inspectors, the United States would lead a coalition to ensure disarmament and to eliminate the possibility for it to transfer weapons of mass destruction to terrorist groups. In March 2003, the United States and a coalition of 30 countries launched Iraqi Freedom Operation, a war effort to disarm Iraq and change its regime. The Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein fell on the 9th of April 2003. Despite disagreement on military action in Iraq, there is broad international support for reconstruction and democracy-building initiatives in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The challenges of post-war reconstruction in both countries are quite serious. So to coordinate the fight against domestic terrorist attack, the Bush administration introduced new laws under the USA Patriot Act, which broadened the search, seizure, and detention powers of the federal government. A new Department of Homeland Security, which consolidated 22 federal agencies, was also established. In 2004, the United States, facing a violent insurgency in Iraq and considerable foreign opposition to the war there, the country appeared as sharply divided as it had been 4 years earlier. To challenge President Bush, the Democrats nominated Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts in that year's election. The organizational tempo of the campaign was as frantic as its rhetorical pace. Both sides excelled at getting out their supporters. The total popular vote was approximately 20% higher than it had been in 2000. Bush won by 51% to 48%, with the remaining 1% going to Ralph Nader and a number of other independent candidates. President Bush was sworn in for a second term on the 20th of January 2005. His administration continued to face many challenges. The history of the United States from 2008 to the present began with the collapse of the housing bubble, which led to the Great Recession and helped the Democrats win the presidency in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, the country's first African-American president. The government issued large loans and enacted economic stimulus packages that aimed to improve the economy. Obama's domestic initiatives also included the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which by means of large reforms to the American healthcare system created a national health insurance program. President Obama eventually withdrew combat troops from Iraq and shifted the economy's efforts in the war on terror to Afghanistan, where a troop surge was initiated in 2009. In 2010, due to continued public discontent with the economic situation, unemployment, and federal spending, Republicans regained control of the House of Representatives and reduced the Democratic majority in the Senate. In 2011, Obama announced that Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden was killed by US forces during a covert operation in Pakistan, while the Iraq War was declared formally over the same year. The following year, Obama was re-elected president. In June 2013, the Supreme Court struck down Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which resulted in the recognition of legally performed same-sex marriages by the federal government. In 2015, the court ruled that all states must grant same-sex marriages. After unprecedented media coverage, business tycoon Donald Trump defeated former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, leading to Republicans gaining control of all branches of government. His election, ahead of the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, was a populist rebuke of the political establishment, as he promised to drain the swamp in Washington, as he put it, and to put America first in foreign and domestic policy. His administration also faced opposition with a series of marches and protests, notably women's marches that brought nearly 5 million marchers worldwide. On the domestic front, Trump signed a tax cut for individuals and corporations and reduced federal regulations, and oversaw a continuation of a strong economy that followed the last decade's recession and the lowest unemployment rates in decades. Republicans in Congress pushed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, ultimately failing to pass a replacement. Throughout his term, Donald Trump pushed to secure the United States-Mexico border and curb illegal immigration. Some of his immigration policies, for example, Muslim ban, or family separations at southern border, or the advocacy for a transcontinental border wall was subject of controversy. In foreign policy, Trump sought to renegotiate trade deals with the United States, Mexico, and Canada, replacing the NAFTA agreement. And also, he made a trade deal with China as part of an ongoing trade war. The Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal signed under the Obama administration. Also, he sought to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Singapore. He also moved the US Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Another achievement of his is that he brokered a peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and pressurized European nations into NATO to increase their defense spending. In 2018, Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives, while Republicans added slightly to their Senate majority. During the 2010s, the country has seen troubles in race relations. After the killings of many African Americans, such as Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Philando Castile by policemen, resulted in no prosecution, the Black Lives Matter movement sparked discussions, protests, and riots against racial profiling, police brutality, and overall racism between white and black Americans. America saw the rise of the alt-right movement. Since the mid-2010s, the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation now consider the threat of white supremacist and alt-right violence the leading threat of domestic terrorism in the United States. A series of deadly mass shootings, especially the Aurora movie theater massacre and the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre, sparked a heated debate over gun control and the causes of these events. The 2016 Orlando shooting at a gay nightclub renewed discussions of violence and discrimination against the LGBT community, as well as Islamic terrorism. This period is also marked by a majority shift away from the support of long-established media outlets such as CNN, NBC, Fox News, and others. The phenomenon of fake news became prevalent throughout the 2016 election cycle and in its aftermath. As a result, mistrust in mainstream media outlets increased among the American public, and alternate sources of news began to arise. A shift towards independent news sources located on YouTube, social networks, and independently owned sites began to occur. Anthropogenic climate change grew to be recognized as the world's largest threat in the scientific community. The planet is on track to far surpass the 2 degrees Celsius benchmark. In 2017, President Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Agreement. President Biden rejoined in 2021. Secondary concerns of this period's environmentalists include the mass extinction, microplastic pollution, and the destruction of the world's last wildernesses. On the 19th of December 2019, the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, for the third time in US history, voted to pass articles of impeachment against the sitting president. President Donald Trump was impeached due to allegations of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. On the 5th of February 2020, he was acquitted by the Republican-controlled US Senate. On the 15th of January 2020, the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 spread to the US after an individual carrying the virus arrived in Everett, Washington, after traveling from Wuhan, China. Health officials confirmed this was the first case of the virus in the United States on the 20th of January 2020. The virus causes coronavirus disease, and over the course of the next 3 months, the disease affected over 5 million Americans and killed over 167,000 Americans. On the 22nd of February 2021, the number of Americans who have died from COVID-19 surpassed 500,000. The United States is by far the country with the most confirmed cases of COVID-19. The country continues to struggle to effectively react and counter the spread of the virus in all 50 US states and territories. In November 2020, former Vice President Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election. Trump and his supporters made multiple attempts to overturn the results of the election, the most notable of which was the storming of the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. Despite these attempts, Joe Biden was inaugurated as the 46th US president on the 20th of January 2021. He was inaugurated alongside Kamala Harris, the first woman, first African American, and first Asian American vice president. Biden entered office amid the COVID-19 pandemic, an economic crisis, and increased political polarization. On the first day of his presidency, Biden made an effort to revert President Trump's energy policy by restoring US participation in the Paris Climate Agreement. He also halted funding for Trump's border wall, an expansion of the Mexican border wall. On his second day, he issued a series of executive orders to reduce the impact of COVID-19, including invoking the Defense Production Act of 1950, and set an early goal of achieving 100 million COVID-19 vaccinations in the United States in his first 100 days. There have been efforts to impeach him, but they do not have widespread congressional support. Early in his presidency, Biden ordered retaliatory airstrikes against Syrian buildings used by Iranian militias to stage rocket attacks against US targets in Iraq. On the 11th of March 2021, he signed his first major bill into law, the American Rescue Plan of 2021. This is a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. He also has proposed investments known as the Build Back Better plan, which includes increased funding for infrastructure, manufacturing, research, and development, as well as climate change mitigation and expansion of the social safety net. So this is it for today, and this is it about the history of the United States of America. Thank you and goodbye.